Welcome. This is Glenn, and you're listening to Wild Earth Conversations. Wild Earth Conversations is about engaging thoughtful individuals in meaningful conversations that connect their interests and insights to the vision of a thriving and beautiful planet. Today's guest is Jonathan Ratner. Jonathan Ratner is the director of Sage Steppe Wild, an environmental organization that protects and promotes wildlife and wildlands, with a focus on ending livestock grazing on public lands in Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, and throughout the heartland of the arid West. He is highly knowledgeable on endangered species and carnivores, having worked for federal land management agencies. He now uses his knowledge of their methods and practices against them to throw sand in the gears of these agencies, as he says, in the service of non-human life on Earth. He is also now the editor of the Wildlife News, which is a highly respected independent news source for articles, commentary, and alerts on wildlife, public lands, and environmental politics generally. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here.
Would you like to make some introductory comments?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of lay out how I got sucked into this issue. A long time ago, like a quarter of a century or more, actually a little more than a quarter of a century, I was working for the Forest Service, a biologist and wilderness ranger. And one of my duties was to go up into the Wind River Range and investigate a complaint by the public regarding an abuse of our public lands by the sheep permittee who was grazing up there. I did that and did a rather thorough job of documenting the degradation that this rancher was doing up in the wilderness area of the Wind River Range. Wrote up an extensive report with probably 150 pictures, etc., and handed it off to the district ranger so that he could take action to deal with it. And what happened was it essentially wound up in the circular file. He probably didn't read more than the first page, but it got buried and no action was taken against the permittee. This was sort of like my wake-up call of like, wow, something's wrong here. And so, I started to, explore the various conservation organizations within Wyoming to have them sort of deal with it. And none of them were willing to take it up because, sort of the capture of the cowboy myth and all that kind of stuff. And so I was not able to find anyone that was willing to deal with the issues that I found. And that was sort of the wake-up call of the systemic corruption within the federal land management agencies when it comes to livestock production. And through the years of dealing with this issue, I have come to the conclusion, along with many other people who deal with this issue, is that public lands livestock grazing is the single most impactful land use in the western United States. It's very easy for people to get disturbed by, there's a clear cut going on here, or there's an oil rig here, and very, very easy for most people to object to those kinds of things. But the reality is that livestock grazing affects nearly 100% of our public lands, but it requires some level of ecological understanding to be able to see the impacts. So most people just sort of assume that the West has always been as it is now, And that is simply not true. That while the impacts from oil rigs and clear cuts and all that kind of stuff, are quick and highly observable to anyone driving by, the effects of livestock grazing take a while to come about. There's a few really classic examples I wanted to share, like just a little north of there, Douglas Creek, which probably almost everyone who's listening has driven by. That is like the classic example of the sort of end stage ecological collapse caused by livestock grazing. So for anyone who, has been along Douglas Creek, you see this basically deeply incised 30-foot down to the creek with sheer walls collapsing sediment into the creek, etc. All this occurred starting in about 1885 with the introduction of livestock that denuded the uplands, and then that increased the runoff, which then went down to the degraded riparian areas and then blew out the system. So billions of tons of topsoil basically flushed down the toilet, like huge hydrologic impacts. And that's, clearly visible in Douglas Creek today. Mm-hmm. It's really stunning. One other example of why a lot of people miss this is the vegetative community. So a lot of my work is related to the condition of the vegetative community. And I both, collect data myself as well as analyze agency data. And pretty much across the western United States, livestock grazing has permanently destroyed 50 to 80% of the vegetative production that should be out there. It is basically gone because of livestock grazing. And this isn't, we're not talking sort of like annual utilization of livestock eating 50 to 80% of the vegetation. What I'm talking here is a loss of the plant community and loss of soils that support that plant community. That these communities are now only able to produce somewhere in the range of 20 to 50% of what they did prior to the introduction of livestock. And that's, essentially a permanent impact. And when you sort of step back and think like, wow, our ecosystems, the foundation of our ecosystems have, the energy coming up through those systems from the soils, then photosynthesis is, 20 to 50% of what it used to be and what it should be. That cascades into, wildlife habitat, like the amount of species that system can support, soil building, carbon storage, all those things are connected to that, that one simple issue. And that all boils down to a single use, livestock grazing on public lands.
Okay, well, thank you for that overview. You refer to the arid West as a sea of sage. Roughly speaking, regarding sagebrush country, how many acres are we talking about? And could you outline the geography of the area we are talking about?
Wow. Okay. Well, I can't give you a 1 million acre figure, but it's quite a lot, somewhere in the range of, I think, 250 million. And, basically from a little east of the Rocky Mountain Range, if you sort of draw a line north and south, so going through, the middle of Montana, through most of Wyoming, Colorado, New Mexico, and then you basically stretch that line west, not quite to the coastal area of California or Oregon and Washington, but that is the, essentially the sagebrush sea. Going from, the Canadian border down to almost the Mexican border.
And it's your position that none of the public lands in this area should be livestock grazed?
Wow. That's another difficult question. Well, professionally and personally speaking, livestock grazing in the arid West is neither ecologically nor economically sustainable. The only reason it continues is because we, the taxpayer, funnel vast amounts of money to support the industry. It's sort of like raising oranges in Alaska. Yeah, it can be done, but it takes a lot of input and costs a lot of problem to do that. And so, pretty much, the same thing with public lands livestock grazing. Yeah, it's possible, but it causes a huge amount of problems, and it costs a lot of money, and we're the ones paying for it.
What are the main ecological values contained in this land?
Wow, another good question. Well,
thank you.
I'll sort of split that up into sort of personally, and then sort of ecologically. Personally, what I love about the West is because of its lack of rainfall, it has been, its ability to support human populations is quite low. Agriculture, the ability to conduct agriculture is fairly limited, with the exception of livestock grazing that occurs. The land's ability to support large human populations is limited, and therefore it remains in some of the best conditions of any lands left in North America outside of the Alaskan situation, which is low human population density for a different reason. But yeah, the sort of the wide open remnants of wildlands is what I love about the Western United States. From a more sort of ecological perspective, we have all kinds of highly specialized creatures like the sage grouse, which, cannot exist without sagebrush, and, various other unique species, Colorado River cutthroat trout, Lahontan cutthroat trout, etc., that have been able to, survive up until fairly recently in these fairly, considerably harsher conditions than such, like the eastern United States, where life is much easier on the creatures that inhabit that area.
What is the importance of this land for carnivores?
Well, it's one of the few areas that, at least some parts, have their intact carnivore network still in existence, and that's few and far between. I mean, in general, one of the first things that humans do when they to an area is get rid of the carnivores, because of the carnivore impact on livestock, and this is far beyond just sort of the modern history of from 1880 to present, but throughout everywhere on the planet, where livestock have been an important part of providing food for humans. Correspondingly, there has been a strong human effort to eliminate carnivores, which are a critical component, of course, of the ecosystem function.
Last month, I visited Utah. I was finally able to drive from south of Hanksville on Highway 95, which is something I've wanted to do for decades. The landscape along the Henry Mountains appears remote and beautiful, but everywhere I stepped out of my car to explore, the ground was pockmarked with cattle prints and littered with cow pies. It looked like a disease was attacking the soil and skin of the earth. So 2 questions. First, is this considered sagebrush country? And more importantly, is it even possible to heal this land by removing cattle and sheep?
Wow, another set of good questions. So, in terms of healing, it sort of depends on what your definition is. If you're talking about restoration of, like the ecosystem function as it was prior to the European invasion depending on what part of the West we're talking about, but, like 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, depending on where you're at. The chances of that occurring are pretty limited, but that doesn't mean that significant recovery cannot occur. I'll give you an example.
Mm-hmm.
Right near where you were driving is Capitol Reef National Park. I don't know if you
we stopped there.
Yeah. So you probably didn't hike into this area, but well, actually, maybe to sort of step back. Back in the early 1990s, there was legislation. Many people do not understand that many national park units actually continue to allow livestock grazing, which is completely anathema to the Organic Act under which the National Park Service operates. But that's a different story. Capitol Reef National Park is one of those that still has livestock grazing in it. Most of it was bought out in the 1990s through an act of Congress that allowed buyout. It didn't fund the buyouts, but it allowed the buyouts to occur. So the vast majority of the allotments within Capitol Reef were closed in the sort of early to mid 1990s. There were two allotments that were not bought out during that time period. One of them is called Sandy 3, which is sort of at the south end of the park. And then there was the much larger cathedral area. And that was bought out about 5 years ago. And the recovery in that area has been gratifying, tremendous, a delight to watch.
Mm-hmm. All right, I get your point there, that it can heal, but there's some doubt whether it can ever completely heal.
Yeah.
Okay. So what would you like to see happen to our public lands, not only in the arid West, but to all our public lands? Do you think they should become wilderness again, or maybe biodiversity should become the primary purpose, or what is your long-range goal?
Based on my decades of dealing with issues regarding public lands, the reality is that all the resources that are, removed from the public lands are done so pretty close to free. So in other words, the resources are, essentially given away to, the various entities that are removing them, whether it be ranchers who pay virtually nothing for the privilege to graze livestock, or oil and gas companies paying virtually nothing to remove the oil and gas, mining identical. So the first thing that needs to happen, and particularly this should not be a big problem with most people, is that, the free market should have some function here. So in other words, at a minimum, we should not be giving away our public resources for private profit. That has got to that's got to end. I mean, it was created. I mean, the whole system was essentially created in the 1880s, 1890s to promote the settlement of the West. Those days are long gone, but we're still acting as if we need to, essentially pay people to remove the resources and thus, settle the West. So, yeah, that's the first thing. Then the second thing is, and these are all really low bars, the second thing is we need to actually implement and enforce the laws and regulations that are on the books. Many people, particularly in the livestock industry, hate me and call me a radical enviro loony and all this kind of stuff. But all I'm really trying to do, and all I can do, is essentially ensure that as long as livestock grazing continues to occur on public lands, it does so in accordance with the laws and regulations on the books.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's not a fairly that's not what I would call a radical proposition.
Mm-hmm.
Like compliance with law and regulation. So that would be sort of step two in the process. And after that, we can talk about sort of like changes in designations and things like that. But those are my the first two things that are no-brainers and that shouldn't be controversial.
And also those are that's where your focus lies.
Yeah, because that's my tools.
Okay.
I have law and science to affect change, and so like all I can do is enforce the laws and regulations that are on the books.
Okay. You have noted that most people who look at landscapes that have been livestock grazed do not see the serious damage done to the landscape caused by livestock grazing. Is this one reason that your strategy for ending livestock grazing does not focus on public outreach or public education? Because the level of ecological consciousness is so low throughout the American population? Is that a correct statement of your view?
Unfortunately, absolutely correct. Like your listeners living in the arid West at least have some concept of what the BLM and the Forest Service is. The vast majority of Americans have no idea. They think, public lands? Yellowstone National Park. That's their, pretty Yellowstone and the Grand Canyon. That is what that's what their concept of public lands are. And anything beyond that, they have not the slightest idea. And so the biggest issue is complete ignorance, and even the people who live in the West, like have no concept of what our public lands were and what they could be if it weren't for this single use.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I believe from looking through your writings, reading your writings, and so on, that your environmental strategy is twofold. One, to focus on people who do not need a lot of attention to get to the place where they understand the important issues. And two, to provide the agencies with science-based research, ideas and proposals, then to sue them when they disregard them, as they invariably do. Is that a fair statement of your strategy for social change?
Yeah, and I would add, just a little clarification on the science. We collect a lot of data, which is sort of unusual in the environmental sort of conservation organization world at this point in where we're at. So we spend a significant portion of our time out on the land collecting data because the agencies don't, and so that's sort of the first step, which then funnels into decision-making processes, and as you say, those are ignored, and then we have to take the agencies to court.
Mm-hmm. You have said, excuse me, and I quote you, "The BLM has no conservation ethic because they are end quote, because they are obstinately devoted to multiple use resource extraction." I agree with you about this. My question is, does it even make sense anymore to interact with agency people who are going, in the end, to dismiss real ecological solutions?
Well, There's a few things to that. Like there's the Upton Sinclair quote of how that it's impossible to make someone understand something when their salary depends on them not understanding it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's sort of point one. The second point is that the vast majority of individuals working in both of the land management agencies, and certainly the dominant corporate culture within the two land management agencies, is that of the resource extraction industries which they are charged with regulating. So, for instance, I over the last quarter century, I've worked with, hundreds and hundreds of range cons. These are the people who manage livestock grazing, both for the Forest Service and the BLM. And of those hundreds and hundreds, I would probably say that 95% of them, maybe a little higher, are either the sons and daughters of ranchers or rancher wannabes. And so they view our public lands as essentially, like the highest and best use of our public lands in their view is a feedlot for their parents' cattle. And so when you come from that perspective, like all other aspects of public lands get thrown under the bus, proverbially.
Mm-hmm. You have said that these agencies are so beholden to ranchers and agricultural interests that to even talk about the tremendous damage done by grazing is too toxic for them, to borrow a term that you use. And you point out that even the big green environmental groups don't want to talk about less grazing and more wilderness because their fundraisers don't like it. Could you talk about this problem?
Yeah, I would recommend everyone popping onto Netflix and watching Cowspiracy. That's a pretty good
What's the name of it?
Cowspiracy.
Oh, okay, yes, I did see that.
As in conspiracy with cow on it.
Uh-huh.
That would be a good situation. So I'll just give you a quick story of probably like the best case scenario within the BLM. Right where you're at, there was a decent BLM manager some years back, and he was faced with the problem on the West Salt allotment. I don't know if you're familiar with the West Salt allotment, but it is basically like one of the larger allotments in the field office there, and it stretches from along the Utah border north of so about 30 miles north of 70, and then going down south to the Colorado River. So it's one of the larger in the field office, and it has been known to be severely degraded for decades. The field office manager collected a huge amount of data in order to support the decision of necessary change, reduction of livestock, for that permit. He did so, and basically was shut down by his superiors because the permittee, was somewhat connected politically, and essentially went above his head and shut the whole process down. And so the West Salt allotment continues to be degraded by this permittee's livestock with no change year after year, probably a decade after that process was started, and many decades since the BLM really understood of how much degradation was occurring out there. So change from within the agency without force basically doesn't happen. And that story is sort of the best case scenario.
Right.
The worst case scenario is you just have, typical managers who, don't even want to deal with it, and so, completely ignore the situation.
These big funders, such as high-tech and oil and gas and mining industries, control both the big environmental groups and the federal agencies who oversee our public lands. We are now in a historical period in which our laws mean less and less. In what or in whom do you place your trust and hope for a livable future?
Oh. Wow. Yeah, that is a difficult one. But the reality is that change only occurs through force. There is that wonderful quote that is escaping me in its entirety, but power does not concede without a fight, or something like that.
Yeah, I know you're referring to. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that's the basic situation with our public lands, is that the only way things will change is when, enough people are disgusted and make their disgust fully known. So in other words, like we were discussing a bit ago regarding my lack of trying to, sort of like get the average person to care about these issues. But in the end, that is a critical component. Science and litigation only get you so far. In terms of sort of systemic change, it's got to come from, like a huge upswelling of irritation of, like how our public lands are being abused.
Do you think that electoral politics, perhaps a third party, is a good way forward?
Oh, another difficult question. Well, unfortunately, in the United States, third parties are, essentially impossible. That has been proven time and time again. While, the general public is extremely dissatisfied with the two-party system, the two parties control access to power and therefore crush any attempt at, something that would actually serve the country better than they do. And so, yeah, my hope for, a sort of third party situation, is pretty close to non-existent, unfortunately, based on the history.
Yeah. Do you think that a socialist society, as envisioned and outlined by Marx, and not its distortion under Stalin, is a way forward for the human species, or at least should be seriously considered in discussions about an alternative society?
Wow. Okay, you do have some good, interesting questions here. So I would have to sort of break this down into this presupposes that we are capable of a sustainable situation to begin with. So setting that question aside, it very much depends on your definitions. So I think most people who, examine these things, not including the general public in the United States, but, like people who actually study these things, that the most successful human organization systems are those practiced by the Northern European countries, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, that have done very good work, particularly since World War II, at creating more equal societies, and greater support for education and human welfare and things like that. So those would be societies that clearly, exhibit greater success in meeting the needs of humans than other systems. When you get into sort of the classic examples of what most Americans would probably consider socialism or communism or whatever. People think of Pol Pot and things like that, which, like are just absurdities in history. From those kinds of standpoints, no, they definitely have no path forward, but the Northern European countries certainly have done a much better job than the United States or most other countries in sort of being able to serve the needs of the human population.
Okay, well, thanks for that. What do you say to those who feel that equality and social justice issues should have priority over environmental and ecological concerns, especially in the age of Trump, ICE, genocide, cuts to Medicaid, threats of World War III, and so on?
Okay. More really
I'm not so much looking for answers, because I know these are big and difficult questions, as just to get some comments from you on these questions.
Yeah. Okay. So can you just rephrase the question briefly again so that I've got the whole picture in mind?
Okay, let me shorten it. What do you say to those who feel that equality and social justice issues should have priority over ecological concerns?
Okay. So, yes, this does bring up a very difficult question. And here is how I approach it, because I deal with people bringing this basic topic up all the time. My approach is that there are thousands of organizations working to better the lives of human beings, but very few working to protect all the other millions of species on the planet other than humans. And so I have a very non-anthropocentric viewpoint. And my work is highly anti-anthropocentric. And so certainly there is value of people fighting for the rights of various groups of humans. But that's not my work. My work is, fighting for everything else and the land that they depend on. And so that's where I come down on this question, is I leave the anthropocentric work to those who enjoy doing anthropocentric work. I'm not one of those.
Yeah, I like that answer. We are in a sixth extinction, yet no one, no organization, and certainly not the state is stopping it or even slowing it down. Can it be stopped, given the economic momentum propelling it?
Okay, well, this definitely fits in with your last question. And my answer to this will not thrill most people, is that if you look at human evolution over the last, say, 4,000 years, 3,000, something in that range, 3,000 to 4,000, we exhibit a situation not unlike every other species, but because of our intelligence and capacity, we are able to pull out of limits that other species are not able to pull out of. And so in any situation where human needs push up against the needs of every other species on the planet, the human needs always wins out. And so for those who may not study these things, but the soils in the Mideast, Israel, Saudi Arabia, like that whole sort of dry area, Lebanon, were completely destroyed by livestock 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. So even at very small population levels, humans are able to do extreme levels of damage based on their propensity and intelligence. And so we as human beings are so far beyond, the realistic carrying capacity of the planet, that any time that we push up against these sort of physical biological limits, it's the other situation that takes the hit, not the humans. And of course, there are absolute physical limitations to that, but we keep pushing that because of our access to incredible amounts of very cheap energy and things like that. But in general, where human needs push up against every other aspect of the ecosystem, it's the ecosystem that takes the hit.
Okay. Do you have strong feelings or ideas about the role of protests, rallies, or acts of civil disobedience with regard to the ecological crisis?
Well, in terms of, if you look at sort of human history over the last few hundred years, let's say 400, those are the things that have been at the forefront of societal change. And I'm assuming going forward that they will continue to be at the forefront of social change. My concern is that, it's sort of twofold. First of all, dealing with the issue that, when it's your physical needs rubbing up against something else, your needs will take preference over those other things. So that sort of dampens the ability on this particular topic. And so, and then the other issue is that so few people understand, the intricacies of ecosystem collapse. There's this situation called shifting baseline syndrome. I don't know if you've heard it, SBS.
I've heard you talk about it, and I'm familiar with it, yeah.
Yeah. So it's essentially like whatever the conditions were when we were young are sort of what our baseline is. And so each new generation gets, used to a continuing decline in the natural world from the previous generation. But because they didn't experience that, where things were when they were young is essentially what they feel is, sort of like where we need to go back to. And so, that's a big problem is, like we've sort of lost sight. Like, for instance, earlier I was talking about the massive and essentially permanent degradation of our plant communities across the West. And, like for most people, they would never notice because they've never seen anything, different from that. And so for them, the baseline is 80% reduction in the plant community composition. That's sort of their normal. And so, that's difficult to deal with.
Okay, well, I was going to ask you a question about that, but I'm glad you got that in there. So, E.O. Wilson believed in biophilia, or an innate love for wild nature. What do you think?
Oh. Well, I think, because we are biological creatures, we do have that innate love for where the species evolved from. The problem is, that shifting baseline syndrome is that the vast majority of people growing up today have virtually no connection to, to a functioning, healthy ecosystem or any connection with, what a natural world would be. And so, that has a significant effect on what their biophilia may be because they've never experienced bio to begin with.
Right. And I want to say again, I really appreciate that you making an attempt to answer these very big and difficult questions. Do you think the best science supports the idea that half the earth needs to be wilderness to support the full range of biodiversity in natural patterns of abundance and distribution?
Well, I would this is just my personal
Yeah.
feeling, but I would say the need is much higher than 50%. If you take a look at North America as an example, the elimination of a wide range of, what we call megafauna at this point occurred within, a few 500 years of the arrival of humans in North America. And so, from our perspective, 200 to 500 years sounds like a long time, but when you give the perspective of extremely low population densities compared to anything, like we're used to today, and extremely rudimentary tools and access to extremely limited energy sources, and they were able to essentially wipe out most of the megafauna of North and South America within a fairly short period of time. That doesn't give you great, great hope. Sorry, but I try to look at these things, pulling back and longer time frames to see bigger patterns. Sorry.
Since grazing on public lands is a privilege, not a right, does this mean that the government can terminate these leases whenever and wherever it wants in the interests of the common good?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Overnight. Yeah. It just, like that. Yeah.
How does the process work? Is the leasee bought out, financially compensated at fair market prices, or is the compensation negotiated, or is no compensation required?
There is no compensation required and no compensation possible. And so, the federal government could terminate all grazing permits overnight. On the Forest Service, there is a technicality, that they do need to give them some notice, but those are small technicalities. So essentially, there is no option for compensation because it's not a right or a title, so there's nothing to compensate for it. The buyouts that you're talking about were sort of developed as a pressure relief valve for the federal agencies failing to deal with problems caused by livestock. So it's essentially a voluntary process between willing buyers and willing sellers to purchase the permit, even though it has no legal monetary value and does not provide right or title. And so the buyout system was created essentially to resolve resource use conflict because the federal agencies were not doing it on their own. So, this has been used a lot in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem for grizzly bears and wolves and certain native trout species and other situations. Bighorn sheep would be another big one where the federal agencies refuse to deal with the conflicts between domestic sheep and bighorn sheep. And so it's really, just sort of a small scale pressure relief valve. It's purely privately funded, and so the funds for this are fairly limited. And then, of course, it has to have a willing seller, so that limits the population significantly.
So, do you think that the government should terminate these leases in which they are livestock grazing on our public lands?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, both personally and professionally, I don't feel that livestock grazing in the arid West is ecologically or economically sustainable. We're only talking about a very tiny handful of people who have federal grazing permits. And for those who are not aware, only 2% of the nation's beef supply, assuming you eat dead cow, come from public lands. So if we were to end public lands livestock grazing tomorrow, no one except the few people who personally profit from it would even notice.
So there are many biologists in BLM and the Forest Service who surely know the severe damage livestock grazing is doing to public lands. Is the fact that they are not pushing to terminate these leases mainly due to corruption and careerism, and what would you say?
Yeah, I would say corruption is what it boils down to. To be more specific, if you are a federal employee and you do anything that displeases the livestock industry, you and your bosses will know about it pretty quickly. And so that's the primary driver why the federal agencies have been complete failures at dealing with this over the last 140 years.
So we're coming to the end of the radio hour. I just want to let you know that, but we're going to continue here, and I'm glad about that. So let's shift gears and talk about wolves, because Colorado is in the middle of a wolf recovery program that began in 2020 as a result of a ballot measure, Proposition 114. Colorado voters approved the reintroduction of wolves democratically. What do you think of ballot initiatives for the sake of wildlife?
Oh, I think the ballot initiatives are one of the few areas where some semblance of democracy still exists. Like certainly as in the ballot initiative for the wolf reintroduction in Colorado, there was huge amounts of money spent against it. And so not a purely democratic process, but it was still successful despite the industries throwing their money at it. So, yeah, I think it's one of the few bright spots in American democracy. And unfortunately, it only exists in a few places. So, it's unfortunately not a completely universal tool that is available to us.
The Southern Ute Tribal Council opposed the reintroduction of wolves in Colorado. They hunt carnivores on their land. Should indigenous sovereignty permit different ethical standards regarding the treatment of wild animals?
Okay. Wow, you do have some interesting questions.
Well, thank you.
So here's where I would go with that is within the actual reservation, very, very similar to private lands. Let the tribe do whatever they want. I may not agree with what they want to do, but that is their prerogative given their position within that small geographic area. But in terms of that opinion being useful within the greater Colorado context or the greater Westwide context, no, it's valid for within that that geographic area of which they do have control, but outside that, absolutely does not have any stronger voice than any other individual American, voicing their opinion.
Why are conservation groups unwilling to question the destructive practices of traditional tribal people? That's a very difficult question. I realize that.
Oh, yeah, you got it. Yeah, I deal with this kind of issue, more and more as we move forward, where conservation organizations essentially give Native Americans veto control over what their opinions are regarding, public lands, wildlife, etc. I find this rather disturbing. I think it comes from sort of two things. First of all is, of course, there was a nearly complete genocide of Native Americans during the European invasion, and so there is some feelings of guilt, remorse, etc. for that. And then the other is this mythology of the noble Indian that lived in harmony with nature, etc., which, in my view, is essentially not true. It's a myth. The reality is that human beings, no matter what their genetic makeup is, no matter where they live, follow the exact same behavioral patterns as every other human on the planet. And it boils down to I equals T times E times P. So the impact of any group of individuals is related to the tools they have available, the energy that they have to operate those tools, times the population. And that basic formula plays out anywhere you go, no matter what the genetic makeup of the humans is. So the fact that we say that, Native Americans lived in harmony with nature is because very low population density, extremely limited energy available to them with extremely primitive tools. And so the impacts that they had on the environment were much more limited than the European invaders with gunpowder and coal and, et cetera, et cetera. And so, yeah, I don't buy into the theory that a particular type of human is behaviorally or genetically superior to others.
That's a persuasive answer. I was going to ask you about the mathematical formula, but you tied it in here perfectly. What do you say to people who think or say that wilderness is a luxury, not a necessity?
Wow. Well, I would say they're correct. It is a luxury. I mean, it is clear we in the Western United States are highly privileged compared to the vast majority of the rest of the human race. We live in a situation certainly with plenty of scars and degradation, but compared to the vast majority of the 8.3 billion people on the planet, we've got it pretty darn good. We have some remnants that can be still called wildlands. Vast areas of the planet have population densities that are so extreme that completely cut off from any kind of natural environment. And I won't say that they do just fine, but they do live. And so, yeah, it is definitely a luxury.
In the sense in which you explained it. That's a very unique answer.
Sorry, I'm just being honest here.
Yeah. So this is a question I ask all my guests. What do you find in wilderness that you find nowhere else?
Oh, well, as a wilderness lover, and having spent a lot of time in wilderness since I was a little kid, I have to say, and I generally go in for lengthy periods of time, and what I find is it takes about 4 days for sort of the dirt of modern life to get washed off or scrubbed off or whatever. And thereafter, my experience, and I travel alone, not other human input during this period of time, which I think is very important, is you really can't in my view, you can't really have the full impact of the wilderness experience when you are traveling with other human beings, is that the mind, that there is a transformation in the mind and thinking that occurs, at least for me, generally after about 3 or 4 days, that is completely different than anything that occurs sort of outside that wilderness bubble where the perceptions become sharper, the thinking becomes more immediate. The mind is not, the energy of the mind is not wasted in sort of regurgitating the day's activities, etc. And so it is a much more present and focused experience. And it takes a good week for that to really happen. And that rarely happens anymore for most people, even for people who do go into the wilderness. That doesn't happen. When I was a kid, at the trailhead, there's, like a little sign-in box where you put in your name, generally where you're going, and when you're coming out. And when I was a kid, 14 to 21 to 25 days were pretty common trips in the winds. Now it's 3 days, 4 days, like that. And so, yeah, it's pretty rare for anyone to have that, the real experience of what wilderness does to someone, like when they immerse themselves in it.
Great answer. A lot of people, excuse me, claim to find beauty in the little farm with its red barn for a few head of cattle and maybe some chickens and pigs. The hobby ranches that are springing up everywhere is evidence for this, I would say. Given what you know about livestock grazing, is all of this anathema to you?
Well, I think it comes sort of from a lot of the human history, but if you sort of take a look at the last 200 years of human life, like we all came from the agricultural world, some longer and some shorter, but virtually all humans, were involved in agriculture prior to the industrial revolution. And so, that whole sort of nature but domesticated nature is deeply ingrained in human psychology. And so I think that's where it comes from. Plus, you sort of got it's, like my grandparents or, probably at this stage in American history, great-grandparents, we're on the farm, and that was the idyllic life, on the little farm. And yeah, just sort of, domesticating the planet to serve the needs of humans. So yeah,
okay,
not my favorite situation.
So I feel that people need to see the beauty of the sage steppe ecosystem if it's going to be saved. But I'm not sure how this happens. Do you have any ideas or comments on that?
Yeah, well, if you sort of look where the human population is in the United States, East and West Coast and North Coast, that's basically where the populations are. And significantally, with the possible exception of the West Coast, very far from public lands issues, very far from the sagebrush ecosystem. Most people that don't live here, their only exposure to the sagebrush ecosystem is, driving from New York to Los Angeles on I-80. And for them, it's like, oh God, Wyoming was this interminable nothingness. They never got out and looked at anything. But it was, for them, it was just sort of like a blank nothingness on the map.
I'm sure we agree that human population must be reduced over time to avoid ecocide. Do you have any suggestions about how to do this? And any thoughts or feelings about an ideal human population size on planet Earth?
Wow. I must say, Your questions are like very foundational and very, very, sort of what is jarring about your questions is that so few people are asking them anymore. There was a conversation on these topics in the 60s, 70s, maybe through the mid-early 80s, and that has completely gone silent. No one talks. It's all this sort of have your cake and eat it too, that, all we need to do is, drive Priuses and recycle our plastic bags and we're all A-okay. That's deeply ignorant. I must say, even if you don't travel outside the United States and see how much of the rest of the world lives, still that is a deeply ignorant proposition. The amount of change that we need to do to bring the human situation into anything that would be remotely sustainable is quite significant. As I mentioned, the example of the Middle East, where we completely destroyed its fertility 2,000 to 3,000 years ago under, a much tinier population with very limited energy and tools. Or the British Isles would be another situation where very tiny population caused, extreme levels of ecological degradation, or, the elimination of megafauna in North and South America and Australia. All these are examples to indicate that it doesn't take a lot of humans to make a lot of change in the ecosystems which they inhabit. And of course, for the most part, water has a lot to do with it. So the wetter the environment, the more capable it is of sort of recovering from damage. And so a lot of the situations that we see around the planet of wide-scale degradation caused by, very few humans are, in the more arid regions, which are by nature more fragile. And so it doesn't take many people to have a significant effect on, ecological function.
Yeah, I think your mathematical formulas will definitely be helpful in answering some of these questions. China had a one-child legal requirement from 1980 through roughly 2015, and it did reduce the growth of human population. Would you be in favor of such a mandate in America in the foreseeable future?
Well, it can't happen here, or it pretty much can't happen anywhere. China was the sole situation that, had that sort of authoritarian set of government that can impose situations like this. The drive to reproduce is very deep within humans, and unfortunately that drives the vast majority of behavior. And so, that's a tough one. In the United States for sure, not a snowball's chance in hell.
Yeah, that's
happening.
probably the truth. I believe that the individual states and not the federal government is responsible for the management of its wildlife. This is the case in Colorado. Does this complicate and perhaps hinder the conservation work of your organization?
Well, I think what you said is actually a myth within the context of the Western United States. So about, I'm trying to think, I could pull it up and give you a link you could post, a little later, but about 5 or 6 years ago, the Forest Service commissioned a study on this exact topic of the state balance between state and federal in terms of wildlife issues. And basically what their presupposition was when they commissioned the study was that the states had, essentially, complete control over wildlife, and the federal government only had control over the habitat, like the physical land on which and what the professors who were commissioned to do the study found was that this is completely false. And their report was provided to the Forest Service, who completely freaked out and tried to have it muzzled. And so they had to publish it on their own. And I think the title is The Myth of State Supremacy. And they go into extreme detail on the fallacy of states being the controller of wildlife, and, the feds only, dealing with, the land, the habitat.
One of Colorado's reintroduced wolves was shot for wandering into the state of Wyoming, and another died there from unknown causes, probably shot. Based on what you just said, what is the best way to fix this problem? What a wolf wandering from from Colorado into Wyoming and getting shot. I was thinking, based on my original question to you about the state having, jurisdiction or control over the wildlife, but based on what you just said, now I'm not sure how to fix this problem.
Yeah, well, the ultimate is changes in human behavior, and you probably remember the situation that happened, I think 2 years ago now, where a fellow in the Pinedale area ran down a wolf on a snow machine and then hauled it into a local bar.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Cody, what was his name or something?
Yep, you got it. Yep, you got it. That mentality of, like treating everything else as, merely rubbish or sport, that has to change.
Yeah.
Not that I have suggestions on how to do that, but, ultimately that kind of just utter atrocious behavior needs to be, at a minimum, unacceptable. But aside that, a functioning ESA, Endangered Species Act, would be another good step forward. I have a pretty low opinion of the ESA. I'm not saying that it should be rescinded or anything like that, but it was created with loopholes, and then since it was created, the federal government has created so many loopholes in the law and in the regulation implementing the law that it is, I won't say completely worthless, but very close to worthless. I deal with the Endangered Species Act all the time, and essentially all that is required is the action agency, so generally the Forest Service or BLM, they write a biological assessment, they hand it to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The Fish and Wildlife Service cuts and pastes it onto their own letterhead and calls that a biological opinion to give the action agency the authorization to do whatever they want. And so in practice, what fascinates me is you see all these politicians of, like whoever. What's the lady's name over there? Bobert.
Oh, yeah.
Like, oh, God, the Endangered Species Act, we have to get rid of it. Well, the reality is it really, it's like a paper tiger, it really doesn't do anything. And it really doesn't cause anybody, any more than if you're dealing with federal lands, I don't know, a few week delay. It's completely meaningless. And so, like, the idea that it is a huge drain on industry is just absurd.
Well, we only have about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to try to get 2 more questions in. The Living Planet Index, which is used by the UN, said that worldwide wildlife populations have roughly decreased by 70% since 1970. What is your sense of how carnivores are doing in America over the same basic timeline? I couldn't find any statistics on it.
Yeah, it sort of depends on where you're looking and which carnivores you're talking about. There are carnivores like coyotes that do pretty darn good in a human, altered environment.
Right.
Coyotes don't mind our situation too much at all. And then you get other sort of rare situations like grizzly bears, which did actually have some value of ESA protections during that time frame. And without the ESA protections, there wouldn't be grizzly bears in the lower 48. And now there's 1,000 or whatever, just a tiny fraction of what was out there before, but better than zero. So yeah, it's sort of a mixed bag depending on the species.
Okay, that makes sense. What are the most worthwhile and effective things individuals can do right now on behalf of wildlife and wilderness?
Oh, another interesting one. And this is also difficult because essentially doing what I do is a fantastic step, that people can take. It's obviously a significant investment, but yeah, a few people can affect. I mean, as the saying says, a few people can affect change, and it is only a few people that do affect change. And so, doing more than sitting on your smartphone and scrolling through tweets, I'm not saying the path is easy and it requires a lot of learning and you don't get rich. But becoming an effective advocate for public lands and the wildlife that depends on them is definitely within everyone's grasp if they're willing to make that sacrifice. And that's what keeps me going, is that it's better to fight and not win all the time than not fight at all and lose all the time.
Okay, one more question. There is no way to do public initiatives nationally. There are organizations attempting to change this situation. What do you think about a national ballot initiative to end all livestock grazing on public lands as a strategy or as a goal?
Yeah, anything we can do to restore some semblance of democracy. I think, sure, the general electorate is not super bright and is easily manipulated, but that's democracy. And so, yeah, anything we can do to, try to fix some of the massive flaws that we have in our democracy, hey, the better. Most people, because they've lived in this system for their whole lives, they don't understand, the incredibly anti-democratic nature of our political system. The 50 senators where, the 2 senators from Wyoming with 500,000 population have just as much clout as the 2 senators from California with 30 million population, 60 times the population.
Right.
That doesn't make sense. Everyone thinks, oh, one person, one vote. That's our democracy. We're the best in the world. Bullshit. It's not true.
This, I promise, will be the last question, but I really want to hear your response to this. The following argument is presently being made in the media, namely, that federal and state land management agencies cannot please everyone. They are caught in the middle between extreme animal rights activists on the one side and aggressive hunting and resource extraction interests on the other side. Could you respond to that? The agency
Yeah.
is that they're caught in the middle between these extreme groups.
I will quote Aldo Leopold with one of his most pithy, perfect quotes. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so
beautiful.
I deal with this excuse.
Right.
I get this excuse all the time from land management agents. Oh, well, we've got you on this side and, so-and-so on the other side, and we're just being in the middle. That is a destruction of their professional ethics. Even within the sort of multiple use context of the Forest Service and the BLM, the multiple use is only after the basic capacity of the ecosystem is preserved. It's not first. Mm-hmm. It's after that is ensured. And so if you're not ensuring that basic integrity and function of the ecosystem, you are not meeting your FLPMA-NIFMA mandate. And so, that takes priority over multiple use.
Great answer. We are out of time, so let me thank you for coming on the radio show. I think your organization is doing terrific work, and I admire your no-nonsense, tell it as you see it relationship to the federal agencies. Thank you, Jonathan.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It was an interesting conversation.
You've been listening to Wild Earth Conversations on KWSI 100.3 radio in Grand Junction, Colorado. More conversations in this series are available at kwsiradio.org or on KWSI's YouTube channel. If you have comments or questions about the show, or if you would like to be a guest, then send me an email, wildearthconversations@kwsiradio.org.